Hello Exocademy. We're going to do a bite splint today in exocad. So we're going to take it from 2 scans, upper jaw and lower jaw, and take you all the way through design up to fabrication. So we're going to start exocad, dental DB, and start our order. We're going to put the patient's name in. Technician, and we're going to do an upper bite splint. So we click an upper tooth, click bite splint. We only need a single tooth. And a lower antagonist. So we have an upper bite splint and a lower antagonist. We need an antagonist because we want to put in our occlusion. Without that, exocad doesn't know that we have a second scan, so we can't. It won't ask us for that lower scan, and we won't be able to evaluate the occlusion. Here in scan mode, you can put 2 stone models in occlusion. I prefer just to put them in an articulator, just so it asks us for articulation later. We save our work order, and now we can move to design here on the right. So we click design, and that opens the CAD app or design. It's asking us to load our upper jaw scan. So we have bite splint upper. And now the prompt is asking for lower jaw. So bite splint, lower jaw. The first step in the wizard is to adjust the scan data orientation. Rotate the model so we see the occlusal side of the teeth. Great. This is going to set our path of insertion. What this is showing us is if our model looks red, like this is the underside of our scan. Because this is basically a 2-dimensional surface, a flat surface, it's not a filled model, red indicates the underside, and gray is the occlusal surface. So this is what this is showing in this left panel. Don't make it red, make it gray. The first step in our wizard, or the next step in our wizard, is designing the bite splint bottom, or the intaglio surface of our bite splint. Offset is how far away from the tooth or gingival surface our intaglio of the bite splint is going to be. Angle is at what angle that is going to come off the surface from. So we have a 0 degree angle. Allow undercuts up to, and I like to have about 1.15 millimeters of undercut. Bite splint bottom properties, we can smooth up to a certain size. We can have a minimal thickness. So right now our minimal thickness is 0.3 millimeters. I like to set that at 1 millimeter. Milling diameter, this is an option if we are going to mill, send our bite splint to a milling unit to be milled. We're going to print ours, so milling diameter, we don't have a diameter for a milling instrument. So we want to apply. And right now, the program is figuring out the surfaces given the parameters that you just set. And this is our bite splint bottom surface. So it should look light blue. You can see here in our show hide window that we've got some bite splint parts added to our catalogs, our viewing catalog. I'm going to click next. We're allowed to start the virtual articulator at this point. I'm going to do that, but just know that you can skip this part if you prefer. We're asked a question, because I took this with an open bite using a leaf gauge, that's the bite, the patient's bite that I would like to fabricate. That's like the patient's centric bite that I would like to fabricate this occlusal splint in. exocad can either bring those models together or leave the gap, depending on the option that you choose. Now, we're asked, do we want to re-articulate virtually or choose which teeth influence the movement? I want to re-articulate, which means basically mounting these models in the articulator. Our articulator jaw correction window pops up. I prefer to show occlusal plane and show the vertical plane. This is the plane right down the middle of the articulator and showing our occlusal plane surface. I also like to remove the articulator so those objects don't get in the way when I'm setting the models. Left click and drag to move the models in this view. If I right click and drag outside of the models, the whole view rotates. Now, in this two-dimensional view, I can move the models up and down, up the z-axis. I need to rotate the entire view to now move them in the XY direction without moving along the Z direction. When I hold down the control button and drag with the left mouse button, that allows me to rotate the models together in this plane that I'm looking at. Right click and drag, and now I can rotate through this plane. Alternatively, I can set those rotations and movements individually using the manually tab. Automatically sets the models according to the incisal point, point on left molar, and point on right molar. We can go into more of that in detail in our articulator videos. So for now, I'm going to align the models according to my vertical and occlusal planes. Great. Click OK, and that will set the models in that position. Again, exocad is going to ask us, do we want to leave the gap or do we want to put the models in full occlusion? I want to leave the gap. And now click Start Articulator Movement Simulation. exocad will determine all of the movements based on the position of the models and the settings that you put: Bennett angle, condylar angle, and opening of the bite. If you had closed models that you took in full occlusion, you can open the bite right here with this slider. Right here at 0, but you can see if I move it up to 10 millimeters, it opens the bite. So now those movements are saved, and we get an articulator movement window in the upper right. We can check protrusion, lateral protrusion, and go forward to our next step. Now we've got our occlusion, our excursions built in. The next step is designing the bite splint top. So this is the outer surface of our bite splint. The first thing we need to do is delineate a margin. And before we finish the margin, I want to tell exocad what the properties of my bite splint are going to be. How thick is the occlusal surface going to be? How thick is the peripheral surface going to be? And how much I want it smoothed. So let's say I want a thicker occlusal splint. On the occlusal, and so I have 4 millimeters on occlusal surfaces and 2 millimeters on the periphery, and I would like it to be smoothed. Now I'm going to zoom in, and for me I like to start at the distal of a second molar, and before I start putting lines on, I come over here to bite splint parts in our show hide window. Click the down arrow, and I like to visualize this orange layer, bite splint bottom undercut visualization helper. This is going to help me see where the undercuts are so I can engage them with my bite splint just a little bit. So for me, I like to go to the height of the papilla because I don't want my bite splint to impinge on the soft tissue. And then I wrap around the CEJ that I visualized that is orange now. When I get to the anterior teeth, I make sure not to engage the undercuts as much because they're thinner teeth. And when I get to that canine, that's when I want to start to engage those undercuts. Right click and drag is going to rotate, and then both buttons together is going to move the entire model. When I get to the palatal surface of the anteriors, I like to build my bite splints just above the cingulum. Again, just not to engage too much of the anterior teeth. And then I double click on my starting dot, and now exocad is going to design that bite splint. Before clicking next, you can see the posterior has lots of contours. If we click the posterior area tab and click in between our canine and first premolar on each side, we have a slider here, desired impression depth. This is basically how much of our antagonist is going to intrude into the bite splint. This is why I like to make thicker bite splints, because now I can tell the software how much of how deep I want that occlusion to be. So I just want a little bit, I just want them touching a little bit. So let's say 0.1 millimeters. And now watch what happens when we click flatten posterior area. Now the posterior area is a flat plane. with almost ideal occlusion. So just by one click. And now we're taken to the freeform bite splint top window. This is where we can add, subtract, smooth the bite splint just as if it were wax, let's say. So let's say right now this occlusion is heavy on the lingual of number 6. Having the add remove box, the shape of a paintbrush. We have a strength slider and a brush size slider, and then the shape or design of the changes we're going to make. Holding the shift button turns my paintbrush red, and that will subtract material. View our antagonist by clicking the box in the show hide window in the upper left. I can see I want a little bit more material here to contact that first molar. And the reason this was out of contact is because the program is trying to make a smooth bite splint. I can see that we still have some space with our anteriors, so now I add material basically to make a flat plane in the anterior. So we have some contact with the anterior teeth. Great, if you like that occlusion, go ahead and click Next. And that's how we design a bite splint. We're done. We can click the Saved File tab when we're in the Merge and Save Restorations window. I double click that file, and here is our STL file that was just made. All I do is double click, and that starts my printer software. I'm using Preform software for a Formlabs Form 2 3D printer. And there is our bite splint ready to print. Now, we took an extra step this time to put things in an articulator. So instead of finishing the case, now what I'm going to do is really dial in the occlusion. So what we see here is a static occlusion, but what happens when this patient moves their jaw forward? They're really hitting their anterior teeth hard, and they still have posterior contacts. So even in full protrusion, now we've got heavy contacts in the posterior. We move all the way left, and we've got contacts on both sides. So these could be interferences when this person is bruxing. So I would say that this is actually not a good design. How do we accommodate for that? Well, now put the patient in protrusion with this slider all the way to the right, and now I can add and subtract material in this excursive movement, not just static occlusion. So let's say in protrusion, I don't want any posterior contact. Well, in full protrusion, I'm going to remove this material. If I want to see all of these movements together, now I put them in centric. I click this bar here. This is the show distances bar. I click the down arrow and there's a protrusion box. When I click that, it shows me all of the movements together. So I can say, okay, if there's a purple spot on one side, I know that it's either in centric or somewhere in protrusion. If I click lateral protrusion right, now I know that this is heavy somewhere in that movement. So I can evaluate the entire movement all at once without having to use the slider. So now I may want it just a little bit light everywhere else except for my canines. If I like canine rise ramps, then I want that one to be maybe yellow or green and everything else to be blue. And I do the same thing with my other excursive movement. There we go. Now I think the bite splint is finished. Again, we go hit next and then click save files, and we just double click here to access our STL and print or mill. Thank you so much.